Indeed, there was a bud. So hi, everyone. My name is Darko Odik. I'm a professor in the Department of Psychology. I'm the head of the colloquium committee, and so also in charge of organizing the Quinn Memorial Lecture. These introductory remarks were originally and usually are meant to be delivered by the head of our department, Jeff Hall. Jeff very conveniently got invited for jury duty today, and so Jeff is on jury duty, and I am on trial for how well this goes. So before we get going, I want to take a moment and acknowledge that UBC campus is situated on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Musqueam people. And we also acknowledge that many different people are joining us from many different places today, and that UBC and Vancouver more generally are also situated on the lands of the Tsleil-Waututh, the Squamish, and many other coastal nations. And so we'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners and caretakers of these lands. So for those of you maybe joining us for the very first time, the Quinn Memorial Lecture is a very special set of annual talks that is organized by the Department of Psychology, and it is made possible only because of an extremely generous gift from an alumnus of our department, Dr. Michael Quinn. And so this endowment has historically allowed us to organize these talks, but also funds many of our student awards. If you came a little bit earlier, you might have seen various quotes from various students who have been able to do original research in labs and really begin their psychology careers as researchers and thinkers only because of the incredible generous gift. So in 1969, Dr. Quinn became the second person at UBC to receive a PhD. He then went on to have a distinguished career as a clinical psychologist at Riverview Hospital in Coquitlam, BC. And we're incredibly honored to have Michael's family with us here today. Agnes Douglas is his niece, Wendy Sutherland is his great niece, and it's an incredible privilege and honor to have the family here to take part in the learning and community building that the gifts provide, and his legacy very much lives on. And so without further ado, I'm now just going to turn over to introducing, actually, before I do that, we are doing this event in a hybrid format. So besides all of you here, there are many others who are joining us online via Zoom. In an effort to maximize participation, especially at the, after the talk is over, we will have a Q&A session. In that session, for those of you who are here in the room, you're more than welcome to raise your hand, and we will allow you to ask a question. But for those of you joining us online, or those of you who maybe would like to ask a question but are feeling a little bit more shy, you can go to slido.com and as the code enter UBC Quinn, and you can submit your questions on your phone, tablet, computer, etc. Those questions will then be asked by me in your stead anonymously during the Q&A period. And so if you'd like, you can also participate in that way. And so without further ado, I'd like to introduce to you our speaker for today, Dr. Barbara Landau. For those of you in the room who are developmental psychologists, who study language acquisition, who study how the mind represents space, Barbara is really somebody who doesn't need an introduction, but I'll go ahead and sort of fill the gaps for everybody else. Barbara is the Dick and Lydia Todd Professor of Cognitive Science at Johns Hopkins University. Before Johns Hopkins, Barbara was also at Columbia, University of California, Irvine, and University of Delaware. And Barbara has made some of the most important contributions to our field in a variety of different areas. One of the most seminal contributions has been, for example, on how blind children learn color words and how this structures their color concepts. Later on in her career, Barbara published one of the most seminal and widely read papers on the bias towards shape when acquiring new words. And much more recently, Barbara has become one of the world's leading experts on the psychology of Williams syndrome, atypical development, and spatial representation as well. So she brings together an incredible variety of methods and populations and really represents the study of cognition and consciousness that the Quinn Fund is meant to support. On a slightly more personal note, Barbara was and still is at Johns Hopkins at the same time as I was when finishing my PhD. I'm going to just share one anecdote because I think it's a real testament to who Barbara is, both as an incredibly fun person, but also as an incredibly deep thinker. So when I was at Hopkins in 2010, the Ohio State University organized this big debate that was meant to be like about the very origins of nativism and empiricism. And they brought Susan Carey and they brought James McClelland to debate each other about the origin of thought. And this was a big event, and Barbara, as was not uncommon at all, organized a big party at her house for all of the members of the psychology and cognitive science community to come and watch this debate together. And my favorite memory of that time was that as we were watching this debate, Barbara sat with this giant inflatable matzo ball, okay? And every single time that either of the debaters said something that she just could not stand or disagreed with, she would just throw the matzo ball at the TV. And on top of that, just as an incredibly endearing image, what I can say is that that ball flew equally often for both the speakers. And I think, if nothing else, that's a testament to the kind of integrative and deep and deeply original thinking that Barbara has always brought to our field. And so I hope you can join me in welcoming Barbara for the talk today.
Thank you so much, Darko. Can you hear me? This is okay. Actually, Darko's mouth is higher than mine is. Good. Yeah, this might work better. This way. Okay. Oh, thank you so much for those very kind remarks. I do remember that, and I still have the matzo ball, actually, just in case there's a debate here and you need it. Just let me know. I want to thank the colloquium committee, the organizers of this event for this year. I really am honored to have been invited. I'm delighted to be here. I apologize to everyone who thought they were coming to this talk in May for the snafu that occurred when I couldn't get here on a flight, and it makes it even more special that I actually did make it to the event today, and have had a fantastic day getting to talk to old friends and new friends, some of whom I was on their dissertation committees and sort of couldn't even remember I was. So there are really a lot of old friends here that I've really enjoyed talking to, and really enjoyed meeting the new friends as well. I also want to thank the family, the Quinn family, for this wonderful event. I think it's incredible that someone would be that dedicated to their department that they would make a gift that would allow speakers to come and mix with the community and allow the community to open up as well. So thank you. Title of the talk is Geometry and Function in Spatial Terms, Core and More. And this is a topic that I've been thinking about, wasn't one that Darko mentioned, but it's actually a topic I've been thinking about ever since I worked with congenitally blind children and mostly wanted to ask how did they learn visual terms like look, see, and color terms. I also, though, discovered early on in the studies that the congenitally blind infants, toddlers, had an incredible sense of space. So I can remember doing the observations initially, which were like clinical observations, and just seeing that this tiny little, barely 2-year-old, totally blind child could make her way to the couch in the living room and put her hands up on the couch just to explore for 2 seconds and then flip her entire body onto the couch. So she clearly had a layout of the world around her, the objects around her, the spatial relationships around her. And I got really interested in not only language learning, but also spatial language learning, because it's the interface between these two really incredibly different systems, the sense of space and the ability to acquire language. So I'm going to start this talk with a quote from my sainted mentor, who many of you know. She passed away a couple of years ago, and it's not a day goes by before that I don't think about her messages. And this was something that I found in a series, the Human Language series, which is a fabulous movie video from the 90s. And her name was Lila Gleitman, and she asked the following really deep question: is language simple or is language complex? Is there something true, some core of properties true of all human languages? And that sort of set the stage for me. It's a question that I ask myself in all of my research endeavors. More pertinent to the talk today is another quote from the same series. This is from Noam Chomsky. And the quote is this. It's about the marble and the box. And the quote is, suppose I have a box, and I have a marble inside the box and a marble outside the box. And I ask, which marble is near the box? Well, the answer is that the marble outside the box is either near the box or not near it, but the marble in the box can't be near it. That's one of those simple things that we ought to be surprised about. How does the child know that a marble that's in a box can't be near the box? That is, they're distinctly different concepts. There are two solutions to the question of how we learn as children, the nature of spatial terms, how we learn to use spatial terms to capture spatial relations. One is what I call a universalist position, of which I'm an advocate. And I have one little clip here from a paper that I'll allude to quite a bit in just a minute by Ray Jackendoff and myself in 1993, in which we proposed that there are universal principles that dictate what kinds of spatial properties get encoded in language. There are very few of these so-called primitives, and they're rooted in deep properties of human spatial representation. And here is a little a graphic that shows the kinds of properties I'm talking about. Those are things like main axes of an object. Here they're imposed on a human body. There are three different axes, orthogonal axes. And from these, if we are able to represent objects in terms of these axes, we can easily learn terms like above or below, left or right, front or back. And that should be universal. The other option in thinking about how we learn these things is the language-specific view. And this view is that, look, we have over 5,000 languages worldwide. There are vast varieties of language. And so there's a view that's held by quite a number of people that there are no special origins. There really aren't any primitives that are brought to bear on the learning problem, but rather the categories are constructed by linguistic exposure. That is to say, you hear in your language how spatial relations are encoded in your language, and that's how you learn them. I don't have names up here, but there are multiple people who have definitely been on this side of the debate. Melissa Bowerman, Steve Levinson, Asifa Majid, many people who emphasize the variability of languages. So these are the two main positions that people have taken. I'm going to go right now to the paper that Ray and I wrote back in 1993, because we made a proposal about this universal base. And we said, we just did some observations. The observations included that there were vast differences in the way that objects are treated when they're being named as members of a category versus when they enter into names for spatial relationships. So when objects are named, detailed shape matters. We basically know what a cow is by processing in the visual system its shape. We know what a chair is by its shape, et cetera. And we've done lots of experiments, Darko alluded to them, to show that young children really do have what has been called a shape bias. They take shape very seriously when they're extending a novel word to new entities. So shape really matters for objects when they're named. But when we encode spatial relationships like near, in, on, or above, we wipe out that shape. And this is an observation that Len Talmy, a very well-known linguist, made a long time ago. And that is the idea that objects are actually schematized, is what he called it. So we actually represent them not in terms of their detailed shape, but only in terms of very, very few sparse properties. So the figure object in an apples in a bowl could be represented as just a point or just a simple volume, but we don't need to know the exact shape. Same thing for dogs and buildings and so forth. We had proposed, Ray and I, that these two treatments of objects are mapped onto the what and where systems in the brain. these are two different streams of processing in the brain, one mostly for objects, the other mostly for places, and it's been shown that the ventral stream, the mechanisms in the ventral stream that recognize objects are very sensitive to shape, whereas in the dorsal stream, you can sort of wipe away the shape. And so we ended up saying there are so few prepositions, because there really are very few English prepositions. I'll say this in a minute, and then I'll also mention other languages, what happens in other languages. There are so few prepositions in English and other languages, actually, because the notions that prepositions can mean is extremely limited, the number of notions that can be encoded. So that was the position, and we based it all on geometry. The theory was that geometry is the thing that you care about. Spatial terms are, and the objects that are involved in using spatial terms are represented geometrically. So this is a cartoon that I found from the New Yorker. I don't know if it's quite big enough for you to see, but it's basically a cat who is looking at a ball on a table, but actually what's in his mind projecting from this thing is a geometric description. It's a geometric representation of the array. So the idea is that's the way we think. That's the way the cat thinks. That's the way the humans think as well. So the kind of features in geometries that we can think of for spatial terms include direction and relative distance. So near and far and up and down and so forth. And the axes that I showed you in the previous slide, different kinds of volumes and surfaces and points and lines, those are all the properties of what are called the figure object and the reference object, as in the apples in the bowl. We also said in that paper that there are other factors that we're not going to tend to, and those other factors include force dynamics, forces between objects. We said don't really matter, those are other factors, and cultural construals of objects. I want to say that we certainly weren't the only ones thinking about geometry as the right kind of formalism to represent spatial terms. There are vectogrammers from John O'Keefe in particular, who for most of his life studied grid cells and other kinds of cells in the hippocampus that allow us to navigate space. He thought of vectors as being the right formalism. John Bonemeyer, Swartz, and others, other linguists who you may recognize. In any case, we believed that geometry was it. And this is just a table of the prepositions of English. You can't read these, I'm sure, especially from the back, but it's, you know, all your favorite prepositions, and we listed them in that paper just to show it's really a very small class. It actually ends up being sort of 80 terms on this sheet, but once you take account of compounds, which are, you know, multiple phrases essentially, and intransitives, things that can't take an object, so like away and back, and non-spatial prepositions, you really are boiled down to a very small set of properties that get encoded. And those are the ones that, although they're in English, were supposed by us to be the things that are critical for representing these different spatial relationships. Okay, so that was in 1993. But since then, I've been rethinking this whole context, this whole framework, because there really have been quite a few challenges for this strictly geometric view. So there are notable cases that many people have talked about where geometry just fails. So if all you have is vectors that indicate the directions and the distances for objects, and use them even for things like oranges in bowl and books on table, you get problematic cases. So for example, this is a perfectly fine orange in a bowl. I'm sure everybody agrees with that. We can also say for this image, the orange is in the bowl, but it's a little bit odder, and we're not quite sure whether we should just say the orange is in the bowl or like on top of other fruit in the bowl. This is the most problematic one on the right, because in that case, the apple is enclosed by the ground object, just like it is enclosed by the ground object over here, but the apple's not in the bowl in this case. And so all you do is turn up the bowl upside down, and it doesn't work anymore. Same thing happens for book on table. It's just fine for this case, but if we have it on top of a stack of books, it might be okay, but it's not as good. And then here's a case where the book and the position relative to the shelf has lots of the properties people think are relevant for on, like it has to have some contact, and it has to be in a vertical location relative to the reference object. But of course, it's really curious in a way to say that the book is on the table here. So that's the kind of examples people have raised to say geometry just is not the perfect formalism. There are also problems because of the widely cited observations of cross-linguistic variation, especially for the domains of containment and support. So this is from Steve Levinson et al., 2003, from the Max Planck Institute, and they've studied the spatial language of many different languages, and they've used this a set of stimuli to elicit descriptions so that they can generate the kinds of groupings that people in a given language produce. And so for English on, we capture things like a marshmallow on a stick, a ring on a finger, as well as something like a cup on a table. So it's actually got very broad use. For other languages, it's quite different. So Tseltal has actually a term that just really means something like is related to, or has a spatial relationship with. And then there are other languages like Japanese, for example, that discriminates between, or doesn't discriminate between a lamp in this position relative to a table and a lamp or a cup that is in this position relative to the table. So they don't care whether there's contact or not. So there's a lot of variation. And it points out that languages vary in how they encode even the apparently simple where relationships like containment and support. It's also been observed that across languages, people use reference systems, those axes that I showed you, in very different ways. So work from Bonemeyer has shown in this image where there's a chair and there's a ball, you can all describe it to yourselves. So you could say the ball is in front of the chair. That is a geometric description. But you could also say, if you're looking from your own viewpoint, looking at this, the ball is next to the chair, or even the ball, I said the ball is in front of the chair. So the ball is in front of the chair, the ball is to the right of the chair, the ball is near the chair, etc. It's also been shown that there are big differences across cultures in whether or not we use an egocentric reference system, that is to say organized around our body, or we use what's called an allocentric system, so where the reference system has to do with the space at large. So just as an example, from Pitt et al. In a recent paper, they've shown that sometimes, in some cases, these are people from within a single culture, people will indicate, for example, that this little target here relative to this guy, that's we would say on your right. And then if you rotate the person, you would think that the same location, if we were encoding it as to the right, would be over here. But actually, they can also use this allocentric, which is it's here in the room, and then this would be the equivalent. So there are differences in the kinds of reference systems that people choose to use. And they've been made much of in the literature, the cross-linguistic literature, because they're very striking. The important thing to note, and something I'll come back to, is that the variation across cultures and languages for this particular set of terms is mostly in the choice of which reference system is used. It's not whether or not there's a reference system with axes, it's just you have to learn which is the right one to use, and that'll become important later. Okay, so today I'm going to ask, is spatial language simple or is it complex? And I'm going to go back to a formulation that we wrote in 1993, now realizing that it's really sort of wrong. And there are two really important revisions to the original proposal and consequences for how spatial terms are acquired. So the first thing to say is that there are two new divisions that I want to propose. One is that there are two different systems of terms. One is a set of geometric terms, that's a focus on reference systems. The other is there's a second system, which is functional or force dynamic terms, terms like in and on. And in those, there's particular structure where you have a core exemplar, and then you have more, and I'll talk quite a bit about data on that. I'm going to focus, in fact, on the functional terms in and on, systematicity and variation in how kids acquire spatial terms. The consequences of this change in theory is actually quite large. I've come to the conclusion that geometry is really easy for humans, and function is really hard. We'll come back to that. So first proposal, the division of labor within spatial adpositions. And I say adpositions because in English they're prepositions, in other languages they're postpositions, so I say adpositions, but they're markers of the spatial relations. So I want to claim that the geometric terms are rooted in the navigational systems. So the systems that we know that reside in our hippocampus and in other areas of the cortex, that basically are responsible for representing distance and direction. and within a reference system. It allows us to go straight ahead to get to the grocery store, make a right-hand turn, keep that all in memory, etc. So those map onto terms like above and below along the vertical axis, right and left along what I'll call now is the horizontal axis, near and far, which are merely relative terms, and importantly, terms like east and west, which clearly are centered on geographic, Earth-based reference system. In the functional terms, those are rooted in object knowledge. It's just a different system. And so I'm going to talk about containment and support. And of course, the canonical examples of those are the apple in the bowl and the apple on the table. The second proposal that I'm going to make is there's a division of labor within those functional terms, in and on. So core representations, I'm going to say, guide learning. That's what gets the kids started. And so these kinds of examples, the apples in the bowl, in this case, the apples on the table, and the way that the language works is to mark the core examples and the non-core examples, and that maps well onto the child's representations and helps them learn. So in addition to there being this core, we can distinguish the core from what I call the more through language. So for example, look at these. The flowers are in the vase and the key is in the lock. Those are fine to say, but they're a little odd in the sense that the flowers are in the vase. Well, yes, but the flower is mostly out of the vase. And then there's the key is in the lock, which just sounds slightly odd to many of our ears, that there's something funny about the way that we express that. Same thing in support. We say the stamp is on the envelope, but we clearly don't mean just on the envelope in some sense. It's stuck to the envelope, it adheres, and so forth. So there's going to be differences in the way that people express these different relationships, which are not part of the core, is my claim. So somebody must be thinking, what's the core for containment and support, and what do you mean? And partly I'm going to say, well, I'm not totally sure because I don't think that there are perfectly articulated notions of a core, but I will make a hedge and a bet. And the hedge is that containment and support are largely primitive notions that are rooted in understanding object functions, things that can, sorry to use the term contain, or support something else. So if X contains Y, then if Y moves, X will move with it. If X supports Y, then Y can't fall without some externally imposed motion. And the best exemplars for these notions are represented in infancy. We know this by the very lovely work of René Baillargeon, which has shown that babies have this idea that an object is stable when released on, for example, on top of a support, but not against a base. So that's the hedge, that's what I'm claiming the core notions are. And I'm going to make a bet. And the bet is that language will help us reveal what these are through privileged mapping between core and what's called the basic locative construction. And this is a term that's used, probably was coined by Levinson and Wilkins. It's the idea that it's basically the question, the expression that is produced when you ask a person of a particular culture speaking a particular language, where is X? So in English, we would say, you say, where is the apple? You would say, the apple's in the bowl. So that's the basic locative construction that I'm going to be considering. In this case, it would be the apple is on the table, and there are different expressions in different languages. So the bet is that the language is going to tell us what the notions are. Three kinds of empirical evidence I'm going to talk about today. One is the core and the more, which is outside the core, guide our descriptions of highly varied exemplars for containment and support. We can get the data on that, and we have evidence from 4-year-olds and adults. These are all English speaking. This is all about English. It should be extendable to many, if not all languages, if we're right about the theory. The second part of evidence is that the core for support shows up early in development, and there I'm going to be talking about studies of linguistic babies, pre-linguistic babies, who map is on to support from below, because they know it's the core, and they also know that that expression is core. Also, variation in parental language may play a key role, and the final point of data will be that the core, I think, may last forever. And we have some studies in adult perception that are beginning to suggest that it's still there, even though it's overlaid with many other aspects of the language. So to begin with, the evidence from 4-year-olds in language that has to do with distinguishing the core from the more by productions, by what you say about the location of an object, I want to name 2 people who have been very important collaborators, Anna Papafrago at Penn and Kristen Johannes, who was a a graduate student at Hopkins who worked with me and Colin Wilson and has done a lot of this work that I'm going to talk about. So the hypothesis, again, is that there's a privilege mapping between what I'm calling the core and this basic locative construction. In English, it's going to be is on or is in, for in and on. So the core for containment and support is in or on. So if we say, where's the apple? The answer is the apple is in the bowl. And if we ask, where is the apple? In this configuration, we say the apple is on the desk. That's the core mapping between the core exemplar and the expression for the basic locative construction. Other constructions are used for non-core examples, and these are some exemplars, and these are just some examples. I'm going to show you data in a bit, but we say before, we really don't say the key is in the lock. It's a little bit of an oddity to say that. Most people would say I put the key into the lock or the key is sitting in the lock, maybe, but it's a little odd to say the key is in the lock. The stamp is on the envelope. Most people will not use the simple expression. Most people will say, I stuck it, the stamp was stuck on the envelope. The hole is in the sock is really weird. That seems like something because it's not an entity, it's an empty space. It's very odd to say it. And then the painting is on the wall, of course, is fine. We can all say these things, but the question is, do we say these things when we are asked? And the answer is going to be not so much. We would prefer to say the painting's hanging on the wall to give that extra information, because not all ons are the same. So our general approach to this question is we developed a richly structured spatial battery that was organized around different subtypes of ins and ons, containment and support, and multiple exemplars. We included hypothesized core and subcore, non-core subtypes, and then we just examined the distribution of expressions over the range of subtypes by focusing on the English basic locative construction, B plus in or on, and then we also added to examine the distribution of non-B, that is lexical verbs, things like hanging or sticking or attaching. So here's the task. It's really easy. Where's the figure? Where is the X? It's the thing that the arrow is pointing to. So these are pictures we give to people, and we just say, where is the thing that the arrow is pointing to, or where is the cup? And this was started by Anna Papafrago and I, who worked really hard on developing this battery. It's the only other battery other than the Bowerman battery, which is widely used, that actually adds subtypes as well as main types. So for the containment battery, we had 6 subtypes. We used 4 exemplars each. So we categorized that, we made the assumption that this was the hypothesized core. Full and partial containment, both loose and tight. And the reason that we included loose and tight is because some languages in verbs encode loose and tight, and we didn't want to just out of hand omit it. So we've got, there's a bunny in the basket. There's a paper tube inside of a paper thing inside of a tube, a book in a basket, and a pencil and a pencil sharpener. So full and partial containment, loose and tight, and these are the hypothesized core. We guessed, that was our guess that we made, was that those were the most basic. And that was actually, the generation of this battery was preceded by extensive reading of all the literature that we could get our hands on. We both are avid spatial language people anyway, but to try to accommodate as many types as possible. And then we said, look, there are also non-core types. So one is interlocking, like the key in the lock, which you could say, okay, there's a key in the lock. It's just slightly odd. And the empty space one, in which we called embedding, so the hole is in the sock. For support, we had 5 subtypes and 4 exemplars each. Gravitational support, which is what we called it at the time. It's probably not a good term because everything is supported because of gravity in part. But gravitational support, it's basically support from below. So the cup is on the saucer. Adhesion, the stamp in the envelope. Embedding, where there is a print of a brain on a shirt, so it's embedded in the surface. Hanging, the picture on the wall, and then what we called point attachment, with just the relationship between a leaf and its stem. And we hypothesized that the gravitational, or support from below, was really the most important. That would be the core. The others are either extensions or somehow different from the core. So the analysis, again, was to look at the distribution of B in and on, and ask whether or not it reflects the hypothesized division between cores and non-core subtypes. First, we analyzed the distribution of be, in, and on across the subtypes. And secondly, we looked at lexical verbs because, as I said before, be, in, and on just aren't good enough for some of these relationships. We have to add a lexical verb. So first, containment. The containment battery, and this is an adaptation of the battery by Kristen Johannes when she went to do more studies, that she wasn't pleased with the entire battery, so she substituted some items. But again, like I showed you before, we've got full containment, partial containment, full containment, partial containment under loose fitting, tight fitting, interlocking, like plugs in sockets and light bulbs in, I guess it's a socket, and wooden pieces inside of a cube, and then embedding negative spaces. So a rip in something, there's another crack in styrofoam, and so a hole in some knitting. And so again, we've got the core types and we've got the non-core types. And we're just going to show these to kids and adults and just ask them, where is the X, the thing that's the figure object? So for full containment, where's the scissors? Answer, probably in the box. It's in the scissors in the box. Okay, so these graphs show the proportion of be in use, the proportion of basic locative construction for these different exemplars. So here are the core and here are the non-core exemplars, and for adults and for 4-year-olds. And all you have to do is scan these two graphs and see that the adults and the 4-year-olds' performance over the types is very, very similar. And in fact, adults and children showed more of the basic locative constructions for cores than for non-cores. And there was also an effect that there was more, they produced more for the loose fitting than the tight fitting, which is another story. But in any case, the core ones, these first 4, are definitely different from these two types at the end, which are interlocking and embedding. And it's not that we can't say that the crack was in the styrofoam. We can say it and we can understand it, but we don't say it. We don't typically say it. So we use other terms to do it. So that's why we've got low numbers on the interlocking and embedding, but very high on full containment, loose and partial containment. So, a scissors in a box, where's the scissors? The scissors is in the box. It's just obvious. So when we added the analysis of lexical verbs and asked, so what happens to the other space? What happens when they're not saying that? It turns out that adults use a lot of lexical verbs and they get more pronounced. All the grays are lexical verbs. The dark grays are lexical verbs. It's supposed to be red. So the red bars are the uses of be in, and then the dark grays are uses of lexical verbs, which, as you can see, fill up the space when there's declining use of the basic locative construction. So for a bucket, something in a bucket, X is in the bucket or is in the outlet, that would be a canonical use. But lexical verbs such as lying in the box or connected to the outlet are used to fill up the space when you're not using the basic locative construction. You can see the same pattern for 4s in terms of what's a basic locative construction, but what you also see is that the 4-year-olds are not using lexical verbs. They're very low on lexical verbs, and what they do instead is they use other kinds of prepositions, like they might say, it's in the middle of the foam. But they don't use the basic locative, and they don't have an available lexical verb to use. So the summary for containment is there are really similar profiles for these types for adults and children. For be in or equivalent, the core is higher than the non-core for these basic locative constructions. And then we can see that the losers in this are interlocking and embedding. There are certain kinds of relationships that we can say it's in, but we don't. We tend to use other kinds of structures. For adults, they use lexical verbs. So posture verbs are used. We observed a lot of sits and lies, for example, or stands. Those are actually only for the core subtypes. That's the only time they use these posture verbs. The other times what they do is they use denominal verbs, verbs that come from the tool that's being used. So, screw or plug or run or extend, but completely different lexical verbs to capture the kind of spatial relationship. It's not the core spatial relationship. It has a different lexical expression. Now for support. This is the support battery. We again have gravitational support, truck on a box, a cup on a saucer, a ball on a cushion. And then we have non-core types. So embedding, where it's like a tattoo on a hand or paint on a brush, where it's sort of embedded in the ground object. Adhesion, where things are stuck on. Hanging, where the cup's hanging on the post, and point attachment, where there's just a single point that is attaching the figure object to the ground that's holding it. So the prediction also, again, is that the core exemplars are going to be described using the core expression, the basic locative expression, and the others will have some other solution. So here's what we have for be on. For the core ones in both adults and 4-year-olds, we have way high use of the basic canonical construction. It's on. As we move through the other types, we have for adults declining use of be on and added use of other lexical verbs. The 4-year-olds definitely show a difference between the core here and everything else, but they don't really differentiate between the non-core types by using lexical verbs, which is another thing that I'll discuss in just a second. But adults clearly differentiate with the core versus non-core. And when we add the lexical verbs, adults just fill them up with lexical verbs all the time. It's resting on the plate, it's hanging from the ribbon, and so forth. 4-year-olds don't. They tend to use these other spatial prepositions that have sort of not a lot to do with the configuration. It's as if they know that it's not really it's not appropriate to just use is on, but they don't have, it's as if they don't have the lexical verbs accessible. So the summary for support is they're really different profiles for adults and kids. The be in, or equivalent, it should say be on. The core is greater than the non-core for both groups. And then within the non-core, the adults show sort of a declining use of be on. And the children show core versus non-core, but don't do anything within the non-core types. Lexical verbs fill in for adults, but not children. So they use posture verbs and then mechanical verbs for the non-core, like hang and stick and glue. Why don't children show the same core, non-core distinction in language as adults? Well, there are a couple of different possibilities. One possibility is that underlying, there's actually, for kids, they think that anything that's supported is of the same type. That is, they're not even sensitive to the subtypes. The second possibility is that they have a limited vocabulary. They just don't have the relevant lexical verbs. And the third possibility is the availability of competing expression choices. That is to say, what do they have to offer when they don't want to use the basic locative construction? And actually, we learned that it was the availability of competing expression choices, and we did the following quick experiment. We did a forced choice task, and we asked these 4-year-olds who are not using lexical verbs, they're showing very high uses of be on, and we just had 2 characters, cartoon characters, and we showed them a scene, and we just said, the parrot said this. These are 2 parrots? There are apparently 2 parrots. I never noticed that before. Okay, parrot 1 said this, and parrot 2 said that. Who said it better? Which is a great way to get 4-year-olds to just say, he said it better. And so we took expressions from the adults' production, and we put them into sentences to compete with the is on. So we said the stamp is on the envelope, this guy said that, and then the stamp is stuck to the envelope, which is what adults typically said. In the hanging expression, the hanging picture, we said the mug is on the stand, that's the canonical expression, or the mug is hanging from the stand. And you can see with the numbers, 83% of the time and 91% of the time, the kids chose the one that the adult had used. That is to say, they're not producing them themselves, but when they hear the 2 options, can you just say the stamp is on the envelope? Yeah, you can say it, but if you say the stamp is stuck to the envelope, that's much better. Can you say the mug's on the stand for this? They might say yes, but the mug is hanging from the stand is much better. So that rules out the 2 possibilities. It's not that they're not sensitive to the similarity space, they are. It's not that they don't know the relevant verbs, they do. But it's the availability of these competing construction choices. So we haven't yet found a way to actually sort of prime them to produce these other lexical verbs, but we did something instead. And that is we made the following prediction. We said that adults who were prevented from using lexical verbs should look like 4-year-olds. That is to say, if it really is about you don't have the accessible lexical verbs sort of at access that you can use, then something should happen to adults when they're not allowed to use lexical verbs. So we did the following experiment. We instructed adults not to use lexical verbs in their descriptions. So we show them the scissors in the box and the cup on the saucer, and we say, we'd like you to avoid using verbs like sit, hang, and attach, and only use the verbs is and are in your descriptions. And here's what we found. This is the original data that I showed you, that the adults have this declining use of be on, and they fill it up with lexical verbs. These are the 4-year-olds who never use lexical verbs. They show this profile. And when adults are verbless, when they're not allowed to use lexical verbs, they look actually identical to the 4-year-olds. So it's that you've suppressed that ability, you can't use the lexical verbs, and so how often will you use is on for these non-core types? And the answer is not very often at all. Same as 4-year-olds. For support, it's the same story. Adults fill it up with lexical verbs here. If they don't like using is on for their expression, they'll fill it up with lexical verbs, which I mentioned before. 4-year-olds have none of those verbs that they're using, and the verbless adults look, again, exactly like 4-year-olds. So it does look like availability of the verbs. They're there, they know what the verbs are, but there's competition to not allow them to use those. Okay, the summary is containment looks remarkably similar over age. There are a few lexical verbs. They're almost all posture verbs for the containment cases like sit and stand, and there's not very much development between 4 and adulthood. For support, it looks really different over age, but it actually looks like the action is in when are you going to use another lexical verb to insert and do a more precise description, and that takes time. I'll say a little bit more about that for the support case in a minute. So we had said verbs need to fill in the rest, and the question is, like, why do they have to fill in the rest? We said originally that there are so few prepositions because the notions that they can mean are extremely limited. But the fact is, I finally realized close to 10 years ago, verbs need to fill in the rest because the force dynamic and mechanical relationships, those functional things that we ignored in the beginning, those depend on very specific objects in play, and they're highly variable interactions. How do they interact with each other via force? And that's what the verbs are for. That's what the lexical verbs are for, so that they come to specify the stamp is stuck to the envelope, the thing is hanging from the hook, etc. I want to say also that the complexity of objects as we began thinking about this results in extremely complex functional interactions. So this is a beautiful panel. Many of these items you can't see, but I'm just going to tell you a little bit about them and highlight some key ones. These were the data that Kristen created for her dissertation, Kristen Johannes. And she actually did this amazing job of searching the web to use 2 properties for containment volume match. How much did the figure in the ground match in volume? And enclosure, how enclosed was the thing? Was it thoroughly enclosed? Was it open to the air, et cetera? And she came up with a matrix of different degrees of belonging to these 2 things, high enclosure and high volume match versus low. So just looking at these 2 examples here, these are 2 examples that we can easily use is in for. So we've got oranges in a tightly fitting net bag, and we can certainly say the oranges are in the bag, no problem. This is a piece of sushi, and these are chopsticks, and they're holding the sushi, and the question is whether or not you can say the sushi is in the chopsticks. Very peculiar to most people, okay? So this is the high on both features, and this is the low on both features. And so it is an enclosure case. You could think of it as an case of in, but people don't. At least English speakers don't. I'll say a word about that later on. So the data from this, she just gave them these many, many, many beautiful configurations and just asked the question, where is the X? And so we looked at is on or is in versus these lexical verbs. And so this is the story for the main expressions for the containment case. So what we've got is the dark blues for this is for the the oranges in the bag and the sushi in the chopsticks, so that you can see the dark blues are the be in or be inside. Sorry, dark blue and this color blue. So these are the ones that decline down to the sushi in the chopsticks. The other ones are lexical verbs in red, and then be plus some other preposition in gray. And so what you get is an exact correlation of the use of expressions with the degree of matching of the container, the contained by the container, with this being very high and this being very low. So this having most of the be-ins and these having the least. That's for containment. And we get the same thing for the support battery. This is another support battery that is gorgeously organized by Kristen. The most beautiful set of stimuli. Anybody wants to borrow them, we should see if that's possible, because they're really remarkable. And we've got on the high end a sandwich on a plate. It's like surface match is really high and is certainly in a vertical relationship. And then we've got a donkey on hanging from a stick. It's I can't remember the name. It's, when you bat the thing and it falls down. Thank you, whoever said it. So this is one that's very, very low on verticality. In fact, the target object is below the thing that is supporting it. And the surface match is no good. It's only by a tiny little fragment that it is hanging. And so if we look at those data to ask, well, does that correspond to the difference in expressions that we showed you experimentally? And the answer is yes. Here is all the blues are either be on top or be on. And this is the sandwich on the plate, all the way down to the piñata on the tree, and that has lexical verbs, or some other preposition. And so this is sort of a massive replication of the original experiments we did with the kids and with the adults with our original images, using much more sort of a very, very well-detailed set of images for essentially a replication in much more detail. So the summary for part one: the core and more guide our descriptions of highly varied exemplars for containment and support. Gave you evidence from 4-year-olds and adults, their production for is in and is on, and also gave you evidence from these non-canonical examples that the is in and the is on just don't work as well with these marginal examples. So we've got a core, and then we've got the more, and we can do it, but that's not the way we usually do it. We usually say other things to have contrastive sentences. The second part I want to switch to now that we've established what the language looks like for 4-year-olds and for adults is the question of whether or not this core shows up in infancy. And this is work that I've been privileged to work with my former PhD. It's been a very long time, Laura LaCosta, who's off on her own, a full professor at Montclair State in New Jersey. And we've been working together on this question for a number of years. And we just wanted to ask the question, is beyond that basic locative expression, does it map to the conceptual core for support? And the reason we used support and not containment is support has much more variability. I mean, tons of variability in the type of support that that can be manifested in the world. And the conceptual core for support, I had been calling it gravitational, but we decided it's really support from below. It's just like, here's something and here's something on top, and it's support from below. So we've done a series of studies with infants and toddlers that gives us hope that the core for support does in fact show up in language among infants and toddlers. So here's an experiment. We ask, do infants show preferential mapping of on to support from below? And the experiment is using two kinds of support. One is support from below, in which there's a videotape that I think you'll see the videotape in just a minute, where there's, it's a black screen and there's a white box and there's a little pink cube, and a hand comes in from the back of the stage and picks up the cube and takes it at a very closely timed watch to place it here, which is on top of the box for most people, and leaves it and lets it sit there for test. The other kind of relationship is exactly the same timing, but this time the hand picks up that thing, it transports it, and then it takes it to the side of the box and puts it on the box. Secretly, it has adhesion, and then removes the hand, and it's sitting there. Okay, and the baby here, is the toddler's here, look at the toy in the box first, where there's just the toy in the box, just the square, the cube in the box. And then they view the two different scenarios, and there are two kinds of trials: a salience trial, where we just ask, is one of these events more salient than the other? And then a language task, where we ask, look at the toy that is on the box. These are 20-month-olds. It was 24 participants. This is just another way of showing the sort of the way that things unfold. There's a flashing baby that the baby sees that gets their attention. And then look at the toy and the box. And all they see is the box and the toy. Look at the toy and the box. No spatial information at all. Then, hey, what's happening? Flashing baby. And then look at the toy and the box. And then we go to a salience trial. Wow, what's happening? Flashing baby to get their attention. And then the events in which one ends on the top of the box and the other ends at the side of the box. And those are done in sync. So that's just to see, is one more interesting than the other? And then, sorry, I don't know whether I said this right, so let me just say, wow, what's happening? Flashing baby. And then the language that goes with the events, the two events, is look here, what do you see? Look here. Then the test trials. Flashing baby, find the toy that is on the box. So you're given the one that's on the top and the one that's on the side. They're both on as far as adults are concerned. It's a little weird to have the one on the side. You know there's some mechanism, but it's still on the box. And then look at the toy that's on the box. Okay, so let's hope that this little thing works, because it's like so cute. So this is a baby who is looking, and we're going to measure their amount of gaze to the different conditions.
Look at the toy that is on the box. Find the toy that is on the box.
Two events together.
Find the toy that is on the box.
So these are the test trials, not the salience trials.
Look at the toy that is on the box.
So,
Find the toy that is on the box.
okay, so
Look at the toy that is on the
sometimes
box.
they just don't stop. That's what the babies say about the looping thing. Okay, so this is the time course analysis for looking durations at the support from below condition display and the support via the side during the events. So the pink is the salience trial, which is just, let's see whether anything looks more interesting without having any language attached to it. And then the test trial is the blue one. That's when you're saying, look at the toy that's on the box. And so is on is uttered right here, and then the measurement is in a time window that's been determined to be the time window at which babies will attend to the next portion of the sentence. And the stars, the asterisks, are the parts of the time course that are indeed different between salience and test. So there's more looking when the baby's hearing, look at the toy that's on the box, rather than simply, see that, look at that, isn't that nice? This is another way of showing the data. It's just actually the data folded back on itself. So in the salience trial, where all they're hearing is, look here, look at this. Actually, the two time courses, the before and the after, look not distinguishable. But in the test trials, where it's look at the toy that is on the box, you see greater looking to the time after the expression is given than the milliseconds before. So these 20-month-old babies are sensitive. They know something about the word on, and importantly, they don't think that it's any kind of on that you and I might accept. They think that it's the one that is on top of the box that is the is on. It's also true that this core and more, the idea that on top of the box is really the core thing, support from below, shows up in the parents' language. So we did a separate study where 90 parents were in a variety of studies in the lab doing different things, and they were shown the 2-second events that we just showed. So in one, the support from below, you pick it up and you put it on top and let it rest, and then the support from the side where it ends up on the side. And then we just say, we want to show you this video that so-and-so, your child just saw, watch it, and then describe to your child what happened. And so the prediction from everything I've said just now is that the ones on top of the box should elicit the is on, and that the ones on the side of the box should not elicit is on, should elicit something more complex. And here are the data. When it's support from below, light verbs, which are things like put and go, she put the thing on the box. She put the toy on the box is one of the things parents will say. So the dark bars are all the light verbs. That is to say, the expressions that are the basic part of the basic locative construction. She put the toy on the box. The hatched marks are manner of attachment verbs like stick and attach, something that you would use to mark that it's not the canonical one. And those are what show up in the mechanical support condition, in the one where it's attached to the side. So parents are conveying to their children that in the canonical case, you can use just put on. But in the mechanical support condition where it's not the core one, you have to say something else. You have to use a lexical verb, and in this case, it's things like stick or attach or any kind of other mechanical attachment verb that you wish. So the third part that I'm going to talk about, and the last part, is this core we now think might last forever. So it's not that they're just used to boost babies to get them to start learning these expressions and learning how the language differentiates between the core and the more, but also it might play a role in even adult perception later on. Actually, we're looking at this issue in a variety of ways. The experiments I'm going to talk about were done with Alon Hafri, who was a postdoc at Hopkins at the time that he did this work. It was with me and Mick Bonner and Chaz Firestone. He's now a professor at the University of Delaware, really happy to say. But we asked, Hafri wanted to ask, is there automatic processing of these relationships by the visual system? Is it something that you just pick up? You don't have to be tutored, you don't have to use special attention, you just pick it up. There's another set of studies that are just beginning that I just want to mention. This person, Zoe Ovans, who is a new postdoc in our lab, who's actually looking at the core versus more in terms of whether it enhances sentence processing. So can it be used, knowing that something is a core relationship? Can that speed your processing? If you hear the word in or inside, will it direct your attention to only the container and not the container or support service, which is what she's about to do. Okay, so let me tell you about Hafri's study. In Alon's study, he designed a study where it's going to be a visual selection task, a visual memory task, in which your job is just to remember one image. And the image in this case is this thing here, which is, I think, a plastic knife inside a cup, something like that. But what we did was we designed a set of containment relationships and a set of support relationships, and all the same objects were used in both cases. So for example, here we have a spoon inside of a bucket, and then we have a piece of chalk inside a small cup. That's in containment. And over here, we use a spoon on top of a bucket, the same bucket, and a piece of chalk on top of the cup. So we have these relationships that use the same objects, but some are containment and some are support. These are all going to be core relationships, by the way. And the question is whether or not, when you're just watching these things and your job is to actually pick this object, you're told, I want you to tell me when is this object shown? So it's, in this case, the knife in the cup. But you have all these other objects. Some are other containment relations, other objects that are containment relations. Some are other support relations. And the question is whether you're going to, so this is the method. Press the F key for this image only, the knife in the cup. And so press J for other images. The question is whether or not you're going to make false alarms to other things with other objects that are nevertheless the same spatial relationship as your target. So in this case, press an F key for this exact image only. It's a containment image only. And so your job is just to press when you see this thing. We've got the distractors here. There's a knife on a cup, and there is a phone inside of a cup, and there's a phone on top of a wooden cube or something, and another thing on top. So the question, these are the distractors. Question is whether you're going to make more false alarms to other containment things if you've seen this. and whether you're going to make more false alarms to other support relationships if you had been asked, for example, to pick only this image. So, very simple task. I mean, mindless task. All you have to do is press the key when you see this image. If it's a containment one, then we've got, for example, this is the false alarm question, but just to go through it. So this is the knife in the cup. We've got a non-match where the knife is on top of the cup. We've got a match to the spatial relationship with a phone in a cup, because it's an in relationship. We've got a non-match where the phone is on top of the cup, so it's not the same relationship. And then we've got another match, which is a piece of chalk, I think, inside of a cup. So you got to understand that if you're being asked to pick this exact image, the question is whether or not you're going to pick the other things that are containment relationships, even though they're completely different objects. And the answer is yes. So false alarm rate for the matches, that is the same spatial relationship, are significantly higher than non-matches, which means that the visual system is automatically extracting not only that it's a knife in a cup, but the in relationship itself. That's the conclusion that we've drawn from this. Key question for me, and I haven't really gotten alone to think about this much more, but I think Zoe is going to do it. The next test is, of course, does this phenomenon only occur for cores and not for non-cores? So if we're to use as the target something that's something hanging, are we also going to get the same false alarm to other kinds of pendulum kinds of things? And I think the answer is no. I mean, that would be my prediction, is that actually it's only for the cores that you will make a false alarm to other core relations, other containment relations, because those things are extracted automatically. So we're going to see. We're about to try it. I think Zoe is mocking it up for us to see whether or not the non-cores behave the same way. And my prediction is no. So back to the proposals. It's the end of data. So proposal 1 was division of labor within spatial adposition. So the proposal was geometric terms is one class of terms. They're rooted in the navigational system. They rely on, they help us move in space. They rely on representing direction and distance, terms like above and below and right and left and near and far and east and west. And all of that is rooted in this really elaborate navigation system that I'm very, very fond of and have studied independently for many years. And the functional terms are rooted in object knowledge, which is completely different from geometry. It's containment and support. They're organized by core and more. So they're two different classes of terms. My conclusion that geometry is easy and function is hard is not something that you're probably willing to accept quite yet. But it's sort of a counterintuitive idea. The geometry in some sense maybe should be easier. Should be harder, and the function might be easier because we have lots of experience with, bowls and cups and things like that, but not so much axes. Turns out that even babies represent these kinds of axes. They represent objects and scenes in terms of reference systems like this. But here's my compilation of facts that I want to use for this argument. The fact is that to learn the geometric terms, things like above, below, left, right, in front, behind, even east, west, actually, but that's a slightly different case. All you have to do across different languages, no matter what the language is, you do have a set of terms that are geometric that work around axes. All you have to do is select the reference system. That seems like a really pretty easy task. That is to say, you have to decide, are the terms like right and left, do they have to do with an egocentric frame of reference where you can use your body as the reference system? Are they object-centered? You can use right and left for object-centered terms as well. Things like above and below, where you want something on the vertical axis. Are they allocentric? Do they refer to the outer layout? Or are they geocentric? Do they refer to the Earth's axes? And so those are only for terms like north, south, east, and west, of course. So you select the relevant terms and you decide, okay, the words, the phonological things that I'm hearing, right and left and front, behind, those all pertain to reference systems. And that's all you have to do is pick this reference system or this one. Same thing with north, south, east, and west. And by the way, any 4-year-old can tell you what the opposite of north is. they'll tell you it's south, and what the opposite of east is, they'll tell you west. Not so much because they know which way is north or south or east or west, but because they know they form a group that's organized around something coherent, the reference system. The functional terms are really different because you have to understand things about the object's functions. And these are things where there's endless variation. There's variation in how kids think about so-called containers and think about things that support. There is variation in the kinds of things that a given culture will consider a container. So one of the most telling examples for me was in my lab meeting once when we were sort of beginning with this stuff. We had stimuli for second language learners of English based on English norming, and we had images and then we had canonical expressions. And one of them was, the bird is in the tree. And it showed an image of a bird in a tree. There's nothing more I can say. But this speaker was a speaker of Turkish, and she said, what are you saying? How can that be? Birds can't be in trees. They can only be on trees. Okay? So the idea that you would say a bird is in a tree really means that your culture has construed a tree as a container. I mean, this seems a little bit circular to say that you assume it construes that, but that is a way of understanding the kinds of representations we have culturally of different objects, and that varies hugely. So there's endless variation, and we need construal of objects as containers, as supports. Some of the other examples that I've loved, this bird in the tree is a great one. The plug in the outlet is a wonderful one because for our kids, the 4-year-olds, very few, if any, say the plug is in the outlet because they don't know that those prongs go into the outlet. They say the plug is on the outlet because that's all they see. Same thing with women, a woman in a kayak. So this is a person in a kayak, and there's a controversy whether you should say in a kayak or on a kayak. I mean, this woman is clearly on the kayak, but we don't say on the kayak. We think of kayaks as being conveyors in which we put ourselves and then move along. So there are huge differences. Some consequences, both predicted and attested. So I'll point out which are predicted and which are attested because I'm an honest person. So the geometric terms are rooted in navigation. I'm claiming that they're highly constrained, and I say that with great confidence because I know that across all of the languages that I've seen, there are sets of terms that are interpreted and used with respect to reference systems organized around the body and other objects around the earth, et cetera. There's limited cross-linguistic variation in my mind because the difference between selecting these two reference systems or these two reference systems seems like a mere parameter change of some sort. I say it develops on a short timetable, and I think people might take issue with that, but there's some evidence from some people that kids actually are very good at pointing north under certain circumstances. They're relatively easy for second language learners, again, because all you have to do is shift the reference system you're using, and the neural basis, I'm conjecturing, actually, if anyone were to do the imaging study, it would show that there's a neural basis for those terms versus the functional ones, in that the geometric terms are, if rooted in navigation, they should engage the navigation circuits. Functional terms are so much harder. They're rooted in object knowledge, and object knowledge, kinds of objects, are so various. So it's much more variable. I pointed out to you, and I'll bring up again, that one of the prime pieces of argument for there not being universals is that there's huge variation, cross-linguistic variation in how people apply terms of containment and support. So there's extensive cross-linguistic variation. It develops on a lengthy timetable. We did this work with second language learners of English, and they had really some serious, they did drop down to like 40% correct when it was terms like the bird in the tree, or images like the bird in the tree, or even for judgments asking whether it made sense. Difficult for second language learners. I say it develops on a lengthy timetable, even though we know that babies produce ins and ons really early, but mastering what the reference objects, which reference objects can be, you can predicate an in or on. So if you think about a plate, you normally think of it as a surface that supports, so you know, the X is on the plate is just fine. You make it be a little bit curved, you can get it immediately to be wanting an in, the apple is in the plate. But more importantly, if you call that plate or that little small curved thing, a bowl, you call it a bowl, it will immediately engage a functional description that calls for containment. So they're difficult for language learners, a lot of variability, and I would claim the neural basis should engage object knowledge circuits. The second proposal, this division within the functional terms, add positions are still the best for the core, but the verbs do the rest, and that's because of this need for endless specification of all of the different, especially in support attachment relationships. So we say the apple is on the table, but we more often say, for the one on the right, the apple's hanging on the tree, not the apple's on the tree. You can say it, it's not, there's nothing wrong with it, but that's not the way people will typically phrase it. The challenge, what about the challenge I brought early? Notable cases where geometry fails for in and on. I want to say these are still a bit of a puzzle, but there's Natalia Talmina, who is a just newly minted PhD at Hopkins, who worked with me and Kyle Rollins on this problem. There's a huge role for pragmatics. And so we don't know a lot about that in spatial terminology, but it's, in my opinion, it's going to play a really important role. There are pragmatic rules about what's most informative in different contexts, and that's actually the basis, I think, for the distinction between the is in, is on, and the lengthier expressions. The challenge that I cited, the widely cited observations of cross-linguistic variation, and according to Levinson, languages vary in how they encode even apparently simple where relationships such as containment and support. It's just all over the place was what the claim is. But I want to point out that these so-called, what are called topological relationships in a lot of the literature, I don't think that's the right term, it engages real objects. They embody a wide variety of force dynamic relationships. And so there are cores, and then there are these probabilistic expressions around the core, depending on what those force dynamic relationships are. And kids need to learn all those force dynamic relationships before they are able to use the terms like in and on that are appropriate. Final question. Can the functional terms ever engage purely geometric properties? So there are very many people that say you probably need the geometric properties anyway. Maybe somebody's thinking that right now. But the question is, can the functional terms ever engage purely geometric properties? And once again, Noam Chomsky has an interesting response. Back to the marble in the box. He says, notice, if the box is a geometrical object, say a sphere in the geometrical sense, or a cube, then the marble that's in a box can be near the box. The geometrical object is the surface, so something inside it can be near it, just as something outside it can be near it. But we don't develop concepts like that naturally. We have to invent them in some other faculty of the mind, namely formal geometry. So with that, I'd just like to thank my collaborators, the people from the Language and Cognition Lab who have done this work over many, many years, Alon Hafri, Zoe Ovans, Colin Wilson, Dimitri Skordos, Natalia Talmina, Laura Lacosta, Kristen Johannes, Anna Papafrago, and Jenny Wang, and the many, many people who supported the project over, it's been like a couple of decades. Thank you so much for listening.
I realized I don't have a mic.
Oh, go.
All right, everyone. We have about 15-20 minutes for questions. I'm just going to remind everybody by going back to the start of the page for the link if you would like to join the conversation online. So there's the link for that. And if there's questions in the room, please just raise your hand and we'll get a mic to you.
Thank you for your talk. Hope I can get this question out in a clear way, but you might have touched on this a bit at the end with like the Chomsky quote, but I'm just curious as to whether you think that our capacity for language actually enriches our ability to think in functional terms about it. So, or do you think that functional thinking kind of exists kind of beyond language and that we are merely articulating it?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. And the whole issue of where does this stuff come from, and do we put it in thought? Do we put it in language per se? So the language is the way the language is. Languages change, of course, but the kid is trying to learn those terms. I think there's a huge area of inquiry for infants and young children to understand mechanisms of force dynamic mechanisms. That's been a little bit, I think, not probed enough. I think it's a whole domain. I mean, I think that's part of your understanding of the world. You have to figure out how do things get, what does suspension look like? What does Velcro look like? I mean, it changes also, so it's not just sort of culturally variable, but it changes over time. So whoever invented Velcro got this idea that there could be this new kind of support. You just stick two things together and it can hold up things. So I think that the understanding of the mechanisms is something that doesn't come directly from the language, learning the language. I mean, it requires that you explain it, probably, unless you're going to sort of invent the theory yourself. But so language is a carrier of that information. But the job of the kid is really to master those things and then integrate, use it while they're learning the spatial language. I'm not sure if that actually answered your question or if you were thinking of something slightly different. Yeah. So it's, I think the thing that's so really intriguing to me about these so-called simple terms like in and on, they're hugely complex. And yet we seem to master them so easily. By the way, you master them really easily if you learn them as your native language. So 4-year-olds do very well in a pretty substantial battery that we've done where there are all kinds of subtleties in the use of in and on and so forth. But people who are learning as a second language, the work that I did with Ed Munich a long time, it's not that long ago, it's probably 10 years ago, we found that second language learners of English, actually you have to have been immersed in the language by the time you are sort of 6 years old. If you're immersed later than that, your performance on these marginal cases, the non-core cases, they do fine on core cases, but the non-core cases are way lower in terms of their accuracy and their ability to understand. Just like the student who was in my lab and said, "What are you talking about, birds and trees? Are you out of your mind?" Because these are cultural construals. So you can only learn that through exposure to your native language. And it's really interesting to me that actually we did that work in parallel with some work that had already existed on the maturational curve of learning syntax and morphology. So this was by Lissa Newport and colleagues, where they looked at second language learners of English who had learned at different times of life. And they found that for morphology, the morphological tests and syntactic tests, you really had to learn it by the time you were 8 to be at ceiling. And after that, it sort of begins declining. We plotted the data on the same graphs, and it's virtually the same curve. I mean, which was fascinating because you think spatial terms, but actually there's something that's extremely complex that you're picking up when you're a young learner, that you can get those nuances. And they're even, some of these are productive. They're not just isolated that you're memorizing the expression. But so you have to be at a certain stage of life to actually learn these in the way that kids learn them. How they actually learn them is partly by input and it's partly by analysis of what kind of a mechanism is that, et cetera. So it's got to come from various places. Best I can do.
Thank you, that was great.
I have a question from online, so I'm just going to read it out. Before I do that, I have now forgotten to mention this twice. We have a reception right after the Q&A. Please stick around even afterwards, join us, and continue many of these conversations. So a question from Slido. Were non-English speaking subjects used in the studies? And if so, were the results the same as for English speakers?
Were non-English participants used in these studies, not the ones that I talked about. Are you talking about, does the person mean second language learners, as people with a different native language, or literally non-English speaking? Sorry?
My sense is probably English as a second language speakers.
So the English, we didn't do these with English as a second language, but as I said, we had done English, we had tested English speakers who learned English as a second language earlier and had many complex cases, and it looks like you don't master even the simple uses of the non-core ones unless you've learned it at age 4 to 6. If you learn it later, it's incredible. And anybody who has a second language, by the way, or has a first language that's not English, will tell you they have terrible trouble learning the idiosyncrasies of English spatial prepositions. Yeah.
So back to the Chomsky quote.
Which one? The first or the second?
I guess, I'm not sure.
Okay.
But
That's all right.
So I take it the way he's thinking about these cases is it's a bit of a poverty of the stimulus argument, as a bit of a poverty of the stimulus argument, as you'd expect with Chomsky. So it's as if he's thinking, look, a completely neutral agent, maybe a Martian intelligence, could see this just as a pure geometrical form, in which case they might entertain hypotheses which a human child doesn't seem to entertain.
Correct.
And where he's going with that, I think, is that he's arguing for a considerable amount of innate structure from that poverty of the stimulus argument. And so I'm wondering how that applies to the kinds of work you're doing here, because part of what you need for a poverty of the stimulus argument is not just entertaining or not entertaining various hypotheses, but also whether or not a sufficient amount of data is available to you to sort of reject possibilities as well. And I can't tell, it seems like, maybe there's a lot of information coming in about the way parents talk, or people are just talking so that a more empiricist learner could learn some of these things, and maybe it's not as shocking that they arrive at the right hypotheses so officially, or maybe not. So for example, in the case where you had the kids who didn't have the lexical items available to them, but they were, when one person said it one way and another person said it another way, they're like, oh, yeah, that's the way I want to go. So maybe that's the kind of case where there really is more data available. So I just wanted to hear what just sort of general reaction about this.
Yeah, so I think, and maybe this is a sideways way of answering your question, I'm not sure. I think I go back to the marble in the box, and just think about any of the core relations I talked about. Why not have the hypothesis that the word in pertains to things that are inside the box, according to our hypotheses, and also things that are in equal distance outside of the box, right? Why not entertain that hypothesis? That's the hypothesis that the Martian could entertain, right? So you've got to ascribe, I think, if you're identifying core types as a kid, it's partly, so I think that there's certainly input because the parents are discriminating between these different types by using different expressions. So I think they're using something that constrains the initial notion of what is a primary thing, just like the babies in the is on the box. Actually, I probably should have also talked about, there are other experiments that show that they prefer something that's supported from below, then they're surprised when they see something approach the box and then the hand retreats at a certain point. They don't think that any kind of support is all kinds of support are equal. But I guess what I'm saying is you've got to have a constrained space in order to entertain the notion that something is in or on, right? So any given example is consistent with lots of different possibilities. I mean, that's the standard way of thinking about it, but they learn them nevertheless, they have the same preferences. If you want to say, like, isn't it all from the input? I don't know how to exactly respond to that because I don't think the input is perfect. And so it would be a case of sort of begging the question of how are you analyzing the input, both the combination of the representation of these things as containers and support surfaces or support from below, and also the mapping of the different expressions. So some fancy learning mechanism that would just pile up data? Is that what you have in mind as sort of the competitor?
Actually, I have a feeling there's a lot of innate structure there.
Sorry?
I have a feeling that it's more of a nativist answer in that particular case. But
Yeah.
no, I just, in order to understand how to navigate between these options, you have to understand how much data they're actually, the kind of data
Yeah.
that they're getting. And in that case, I was a little surprised that the kids were like, no, I want it to be described the way
one.
that person describes, and not the way that person describes it, which suggests that they're really tuned into a lot of linguistic information that maybe could guide them a little bit more.
Well, in that case, I mean, I think you're right. They are tuned into a lot of information, and we don't have the studies that say sort of how much are you processing and storing and remembering about the particular expressions that go with different kinds of configurations. I mean, I think we just don't know. One of the things that surprised me is a study that Laura and I did sort of as a first pass when we wanted to find out, well, do kids, really young kids, toddlers who have vocabulary in the childist database, when they use on, for example, do they use it always for canonical support from below? And that would be sort of cool, because that would be saying like they're screening everything out. So we looked at that, and it is a majority of the utterances are support from below, but weirdly, and I've never figured this one out except that it makes me realize how important the input is as well, they use it for things like on time. I mean, that's an exception because that might be just a collocation, but they use it for very sort of things that they might have picked up from their parents' speech that are very surprising. So I'm trying to think of good examples with on. Well, let me take some of the ins. I mean, I actually have a slide with a bunch of examples, but like in my hair, that's really weird. Okay, if you think that the canonical example is like a container, that's not going to happen. So the way that I think about that is, I think, and I've sort of no proof for this other than sort of logically, I think it makes sense. I think there are two different ways of processing these things. One is with your core configurations, where you're chunking it in, you're taking it in, and you're learning that. And the other is corpus analyses, where you are learning so much more that doesn't have anything to do with this core that's sitting over here. And so eventually some of those guys will come in and you'll get new expressions for other kinds of in relationship, but you're also going to learn things like, what's on your mind, that have nothing to do with anything, but could easily be picked up. So that's sort of all I have to say. I personally, I mean, I have a nativist bias, as you obviously know. And I mean, I'd welcome any suggestions that you think would be like really convincing to say, well, no, it's not that I want to say it's not the data. I don't want to say that. All I'm saying is it has to be viewed through a lens that is filtering that data.
Hi. I was hoping to get some clarification maybe on the knife in the cup experiment. So you showed that there was the other things, the other objects, which were like in objects as opposed to being on objects, were more distractors. You didn't, as far as I recall, present data on how frequently the knife on the cup was a distractor relative to the other on things. Was there a specific relationship there?
Are you wondering whether or not it was the particular item they were remembering or not remembering?
Yeah, I'm curious to see.
No, I mean, there's a stream in which, so the target, you're right, the knife, if it's the knife in the cup, then there's not going to be a target that's a knife on the cup. But there are going to be targets that are, the banana in the bowl. And those are the things that get false alarmed. So the point is just that the false alarming is showing that you are representing the thing, not just in terms, I mean, I think you're representing them in the way that I think about how do we represent spatial relationships. So you've got two objects, a figure and a ground, it's X and Y, and there's a containment relationship or there's a support relationship. So it's a really sparse representation. And those are showing you're doing an X and a Y with a specification that the relationship is containment or support. So if you can swap out all the objects, you don't care, the objects don't make any difference. I don't care if it's a knife anymore. All I care is that, yeah, I saw that one, but it was actually a banana in a cup. Does that clarify?
I think so. I was sort of curious to see if the recognizing the object as a knife and as a cup had greater or lesser priority than recognizing the relationship between two objects being in or on.
I don't think I have an answer to that, although it might be in the paper. The paper's actually up on PsychArchive, so you can look it up, or I can send it to you if you want. I'm not sure. I'm just trying to think of. I know we ruled out a bunch of things. So Alon did these diffeomorphic transformations to see whether or not if you scrambled everything, would you still get the same effect? And there's nothing there. So it's not in the low level. I mean, so one of the big, questions that's floating around when people in the perception of spatial relationships do you really perceive those relations? Do you perceive containment, or is that a higher level construction? So one of the things that's been floating around is, are there not perceptual correlates in the stimulus that might tell you, signify that it's contained? Like there's some occlusion. That's the big one. It must be occlusion. I think that's really misguided, because why is occlusion any simpler or more accessible to the perceptual system than containment? So you're trying to explain it with other kinds of, and that's what the transformation experiment, the transformations on the image was supposed to address, partly, like maybe they're picking up on occlusion. That doesn't seem to make sense to me, but if it were true, you'd preserve some elements of occlusion even with the transformations, and it all washes out. Yeah. Does that help? Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay.
All right, everyone. I know there are lots more questions, but unfortunately we are out of time. But again, I want to encourage everybody, stick around for the reception. Barbara will be there too. Please feel free to ask any questions there. And please join me one more time in thanking Barbara for a wonderful talk today.